Ambassador Christopher Hill, who joins us now. He spent 33 years with the U.S. State Department. His book, Outpost, Life on the Front Lines of American Diplomacy. Hill's final posting was as ambassador to Iraq. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us. I should say I read the book over the weekend. I enjoyed it very much. I am going to focus on the last few chapters about your posting in Iraq, but people should read it because it is a very interesting life you had led. Ambassador, Leon Panetta told USA Today about the Islamist threat. Quote, I think we're looking at kind of a 30-year war. Do you agree?
Well, I don't know if we're looking at a 30-year war, but we're certainly looking at something that's not going to be over in a couple of months. I mean, this is a long time in brewing. I think we've really had some troubles dealing with it. After all, we go into Iraq in 2003, and for many countries in the region, what we did was to flip a Sunni-led country into a Shia-led country. And it's still, I think, a very open proposition whether the Sunni world and the Sunni world in the Arab world is every other country besides Iraq, basically. And the real question is whether they will accept a Shia-led Iraq. So certainly this is a long-term proposition, and I think the administration has its hands full.
In your book, you write throughout about attempts of the United States to do something and it doesn't necessarily work out according to plan. You talk about that specifically in the Iraq posting when it comes to whether or not the U.S. should back Maliki or not. Now we hear, you just heard Nick Payton-Walsh talk about how sentiment on the ground, a small group of Iraqis and Syrians are now finding sentiment and finding favor with al-Nusra. The leaders of the Pakistani Taliban, a group that includes roughly 100 jihadi organizations, now they say that they're supporting ISIS. Did you think when the American-led airstrikes began that they would have this effect that we're starting to see of uniting all these Islamist groups that had been fighting until now?
Yeah, and I think some of this may be the reason why the Vice President kind of undiplomatically, if I can use that term, spoke about some of the problems in the region. Clearly, the Obama administration was concerned about this, and that's why they made Maliki the sort of, linchpin of the whole problem, going after the situation in Baghdad. Part of that was to assure the Sunnis in the region that we were on to the fact that, Maliki was not God's gift to Iraq. So we tried to do that, but I think, as this latest headline suggests, we have some problems convincing the Sunnis that they need to do something about their own Sunnis. And that has been a huge problem ever since this civil war erupted in Syria. I think in the United States there's much too much of this notion that somehow you have on the one hand this evil dictator and on the other hand you have these wonderful people interested in democracy, when in fact to a great extent what we've seen in Syria is a sectarian knife fight, and it's been a knife fight for some time.
Speaking of what Joe Biden had to say, the Vice President, he faulted Turkey, the UAE, Saudi Arabia for letting fighters go into Iraq and Syria, especially into Syria. I guess, first of all, is what he said true? And second of all, how big a diplomatic problem did he create?
Well, on the latter point, I think, as your piece suggested, he has some damage control to do. How true it is, how central it is, that's another question. Certainly, we'd like to see more from all of these countries in terms of dealing with this ISIS threat, and yet they've all been very reticent, and they all have their reasons for being careful about it. But I think really an important element of our diplomacy needs to be to get these countries on board. But often when you sort of call out countries in public, I'm not sure that's probably the best way to do that.
But I'm kind of reading between the lines here of what you said that it wasn't necessarily wrong what he said in terms of just as a factual matter.
I think you can read between the lines quite correctly there. It wasn't necessarily wrong, but we need to do something about it. And the question is whether calling them out publicly is the best way to do something about it.
All right, Ambassador Chris Hill, thank you.